Hi, Joshua. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. So, I'm doing something special. I do these topic videos once a month where I usually address common questions that I get from parents. And something that's really been on my mind lately, especially after having spoken to you on Gender a Wider Lens in May, is just the difficulty that parents of young adults have when their relationship seems to be in a rocky place, or the child's
Mhm.
making extreme demands and then pulling away, or after fully kind of becoming estranged from an adult child. So I was
Yeah.
really excited that you were open to chatting with me in this kind of different format today. So thank you so much for joining me for my parent membership group.
Yeah. No, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be back.
So you've written two books. One is called When Parents Hurt, and the other is called The Rules of Estrangement. Can you just tell the audience a little bit about, like, what are these two books about? How are they different? And you've told us a lot about your work on Gender a Wider Lens, but maybe for those who haven't gotten to see that interview, like a bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So I wrote the first book in When Parents Hurt in 2007, and I wrote it after a successful reconciliation with my daughter. As I mentioned in our last podcast, I was married and divorced in my 20s and have an adult daughter who I'm very close to. But there was a period of time in her early 20s where she'd cut off contact with me for several years, which was really awful. And nothing was written really to help. So it really wasn't until I eventually reconciled with her through empathy and non-defensiveness and non-explaining, et cetera, that we were able to reconcile. And so as a result of that, I wrote my first book, When Parents Hurt. And as a result of that, got a wide following of parents in the U.S. primarily, but in other Anglophone countries who are dealing with this. And then as a result of that, developed a webinar series, which I've been doing since then, and a free Q&A every other Monday, which I've been doing since then. So I got a wide following of estranged parents. So I wrote my more recent book, Rules of Estrangement, in 2021, based on all the parents that I've been seeing since then and the research that I did as a result of that. So
Mhm.
the books are very similar. The main difference is that at the time I wrote the first book, I wasn't really nearly as aware how much outside influences like a motivated partner, romantic partner, what I call the cult of one, can be an estrangement. I have a chapter on kids who are what I call flashpoints, estrangements that come through gender identity issues and political differences and that kind of thing. Chapter on grandparents, and so there's quite a bit added in the second book that makes it different from the first.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things we've talked about in the full episode on Gender a Wider Lens, and just you and I before we started, is that the landscape around political and gender issues is rapidly evolving very, very quickly. And even for
Yep.
myself and Stella and Lisa, when we wrote our book, we thought we'd be putting the finishing touches on stuff, and then like some crazy thing would happen in the news, and then we'd have to kind of scramble and rearrange.
Right.
So, between 2021 and now, I can imagine that there are a lot of things you've learned and observed as the culture and kind of news around gender affirmation has changed. And we touched on this a little bit before we started recording, but is there anything that, you might have approached a little bit differently had you written about gender and family estrangement now?
Yeah, I think I would be more conservative about the affirming care than I was at the time that I wrote the book. I think at the time the thinking was you should be affirming, and anything short of that is problematic. And since then, as a result of the CAST report and your work, quite frankly, and other people in this space, I've become much more cautious about recommending gender affirming care. And so, yeah, if I were to rewrite that chapter, I would write it with a much more cautionary note than I did when I first wrote it.
Yeah. What's also interesting about that is, we can be, as let's say, concerned professionals or parents who are listening, we can be very concerned about the affirmation model. And at the same time, that doesn't change the fact that the young people who are making demands of their parents are fully bought in. So it's
Right.
this very complicated balance. And,
It
this
is.
kind of brings me to like a point I just want to reiterate as we have this conversation. Today you and I, Josh, will be talking about parents of adults, kids who
Right.
are over 18, living outside of the home, And frankly, I mean, if you have an adult child and your relationship is fantastic and your child tolerates some of that tension or feedback, this is not a conversation for you. This is a
Right.
conversation for parents whose kids are on the verge of estranging or are pulling away very dramatically or have literally estranged. So if
Right.
you have a 15-year-old who's still living under your roof, this is not going to be advice that necessarily serves you. Is
Right.
there anything else you want to add to that? I just want to make sure people understand, like, who is this conversation for?
No, I think it's a good point. I think that what a lot of parents don't realize, particularly in this moment, is that once a child is an adult, that ship has largely sailed. I mean, parents still have some influence, but particularly when a kid has estranged themselves, a young adult has estranged themselves or they're close to it, the use of parental authority, particularly things like guilt or criticism or shame, et cetera, that might have worked for other generations and still works in many other cultures, as you and I talked a little bit about last time, doesn't work and is actually going to alienate your child even further. So I think it's really important for parents to have that model in mind.
Hmm. And even, I have a video where I talk about young adults and I say the importance of knowing your own child, right?
Yeah,
Because sometimes you have a kid who, yes, technically they're 19, but they're actually very compliant and they still want to please you. And you may be able to say, without damaging the relationship at all, honey, while you're in college, we really don't think medicalizing is a good idea, whether it's like a nose job, a boob job, or gender affirmation. We don't think that's a good idea. We want you to focus on your studies. No harm, no foul. On the other
right,
hand, there are kids who are maybe due to the extreme indoctrination or their own mental health issues. If you even slightly try to set a healthy boundary, they are going to pull away. And maybe there's 10 people waiting in the wings to support them financially or through the social affirmation or whatever. So
right.
knowing your situation is really, really important. And so, with that kind of caveat, I'd love to jump into just having you explain what the amends letter is. Who would write an amends letter? What is in the amends letter? And then I'd love to share with you my reset conversation, which I think has a lot of parallels. So tell us about the amends letter.
Well, in the context of a kid who's alienated around gender identity issues, an amends letter would try to speak to what the adult child's experience was of the parent. And often that, parents, once a kid is estranged, there's a huge disparity in the parent's perspective on the child and the history and the now adult child's perspective. And from the parent's perspective, there can be a complete rewriting of history. So I've often seen in kids who are transitioning or want to transition saying, well, it was obvious, I was playing with, girls' toys when I was young, and the parents like, actually, no, you weren't. There was nothing, they were completely gender congruent throughout your whole childhood. So this is completely out of the blue. But the adult child is now accusing the parent of gaslighting them and, not seeing how upset they were, not acknowledging how depressed they were. And, and now they're maintaining that their depression was because the parents was emotionally abusing them by pushing back on them and basically generating conversations that may not have even occurred. So you're never going to convince, anybody, quite frankly, that their view of history is wrong, particularly your adult child. So you're far better off acknowledging that perhaps they're right. It's what I call the separate realities nature of family life. You might say something like, well, I guess it's clear that I have blind spots, that I wasn't able to see that. And I could see how if you were expressing that to me and I wasn't recognizing it, I could see how that could have been very hurtful to you or very disorienting to you. So I'm glad you let me know. I'm completely open to having a conversation about that now with you. If you'd like to go into therapy with me, with somebody who's sensitive to these issues, I'm happy to do that. If you want me to work on issues in my own therapy, I'm more than happy to do that. My greatest ambition is your happiness and healing whatever harm I've caused you in our relationship. Now, for some parents, that's a bridge too far to even acknowledge the adult child's reality because they feel like they're sort of enabling a false reality. And it's particularly challenging with kids who have mental health issues. And
Mm,
so there are certain things that I don't think parents should find the kernel of truth to say. For example, now increasingly I see, parents being accused of false accusations of sexual abuse. I don't think if the parent is clear that they didn't do sexual abuse, sexually abuse their child, I don't really think there's a way to nuance that. I think parents should say
yeah.
something like, there's no way I could have done that to you or any other child because it's just not something I'm capable of doing. But they still have to pivot back to the child's perspective. They still have to say something like, but I also know that sometimes people remember things in a certain way because they're trying to unearth other things about the relationship that didn't feel good. So I'm certainly welcome and open to having that kind of a conversation with you.
Wow.
So does that address your question about the
Yeah,
amends?
it's amazing that you say that about the sexual abuse memories, because I did a video about this where I delved into the repressed memories epidemic that happened in the 90s, the 80s and
Right.
90s. And there was an interview with a father who was being accused, and he said, I believe that my daughter 100% believes these things happened. She's so distressed because she had been through like all of this basically memory affirming therapy is almost like what it is. So it's
Yeah.
remarkable how sincere the young person might be in their
Right.
misrecollection.
Right.
And it's important for parents to understand that it's a sensitive place because, I always remember when I was in school talking about family therapy or relationship therapy. One of my professors said, it's always the less developed person who's in control of the
It's true.
relationship. And
That's
the
right.
same thing is true in a parent-child dynamic. So if your child is the
Absolutely.
one who's kind of psychologically vulnerable and wounded by all these beliefs they've imbibed, you
Right.
have to be the bigger person and almost
Yes.
play chess around this.
Yes.
So what you're saying really resonates with me there. And yeah, go ahead.
No, it's such an important point, and often there's sort of a proportional relationship between how much the adult child has to blame themselves and how poorly the adult child is doing. And things like sexual abuse, trauma, neglect, emotional abuse, those are all sort of big, powerful narratives that can explain to an adult child why they have the issues that they have. And that's why I think the Israeli sociologist quote of, today our lives are plotted backwards. What's a dysfunctional family? It's a family where your needs weren't met. How do you know your needs weren't met? By looking at your present condition. So many young adults are coming into adulthood with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and they're assuming that there's a traumatic history in their past. And for some of them, there absolutely is.
Yeah.
Sexual abuse is real. Incest is real. Physical, those are all real things.
Yeah.
It's just that so many parents are being wrongly accused of that. But parents still have to find a way to join their child in the narrative. They don't have to agree with them. But that's why I like the statement of, well, it's clear that I have blind spots, that I wasn't aware that you were feeling so hurt or so neglected or that kind of thing. Because it's a way for the parent to have integrity with their own perspective while also acknowledging the adult child's perspective.
Yeah. And another thing that line, like I recognize I might have blind spots. Another thing it reminds me of is something that I talk with parents about, which is that there's always like a kernel of authentic truth within
Right.
these narratives, right?
Right.
And so one of the things I invite parents to say is something like, of course, as you've gotten older, there are things about you that I didn't know.
Right.
And that's not the same thing as saying, I literally believe you're a girl now, or I literally
Right.
believe you're a boy. But it's
Right.
like, of course, there are going to be things that you discover about yourself that I could not have foreseen, even though as your parent, I do think I know you pretty well, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think that's an acknowledgement of the natural individuation process without having to confirm the specific conclusion that the child has drawn. And so that can
Right.
help to lower the defenses again.
I think that's lovely. I love that statement. Yeah.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
gonna
thank you.
use that myself.
Yeah, feel free. So then the amends letter, the purpose of it is what? To just reestablish communication, or like kind of give us a broad overview of when would the amends letter be appropriate to send to a child? Like,
I think in almost every case it's appropriate because you're trying to get on the same page as the adult child. You're trying to see if it's possible. And frankly, it isn't always possible. There are some adult children who've cut off the parent because of bad therapy or because their online group tells them that anybody who doesn't immediately endorse, top surgery or other gender affirming care, they're transphobic and you should get rid of them, or they're negatively influenced by somebody else or by an ex, if there's a divorce. So there's so many pathways to an adult child not being open and willing to make amends. But for those who really are, It's a way to get on the same page with the adult child. And I always tell parents to start by saying, I know you wouldn't do this unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Now, from the parent's perspective, it's absolutely not the healthiest thing for them to do. And from my perspective as a therapist, it may not be the healthiest thing for them to do. But the adult child wouldn't be doing it unless they felt like it was the healthiest thing for them to do. And parents have to understand that protection of my mental health and my happiness and my self-esteem, that is a new moral framework. The old moral framework of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever, that ship has sailed. So parents need to completely let go of that one and think purely from the context of, from the child's perspective, is this relationship in line with their aspirations for their mental health and happiness and personal growth or not? If not, it's see it, parent. Parents have no authority. So in saying you wouldn't do this unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do, that's the way to you sort of get on the same page with the child, and the child can feel like, oh, okay, I have somebody here I can work with. And then the parent begins to acknowledge, as to your point, sort of the kernels of truth in the mistakes that they made, if not the bushels. I mean, we all make massive mistakes as parents, so it shouldn't be too hard to find mistakes. So
that's very interesting. And what I'm kind of becoming aware of as we talk is that oftentimes with these particular types of families, the child will acknowledge that other than the gender thing, the relationship is great. So what you often see is that the child is making a very specific demand of the parent. So it's not like this diffuse, like my parents were always terrible parents to me and this gender thing just made me aware of it. It's usually like they've always supported me. How can they not support this one thing? And so what comes up for me is like, in addition to the piece that you just raised with the way you write the amends letter, I often ask parents to say something very similar, which is, because the kids usually like, why can't you accept my transition? Or why can't you support my identity? And so sometimes I say to parents, why don't you consider saying, I understand that you wouldn't be transitioning unless you felt it was the healthiest thing to do.
Yeah,
I
same thing.
understand that you are trying to, fill in the blank in a way that's true for your child. So what is your child
Right.
trying to do? Are they trying to understand who they are? Are they trying to make sense of their idiosyncrasies? Are they trying to feel better in their body? Maybe she had a 5-year eating disorder and now all of a sudden transition
Yeah.
is the answer. So if you can acknowledge the positive impulse behind the transition, it's similar to what
Yeah.
you're saying. Like there may be a positive impulse that your child has of trying to estrange. Like it may be
Right.
misdirected in some cases, but children, young adult children, are not doing these things just willy-nilly. They
Right.
genuinely believe that getting away from mom and dad or taking testosterone or getting top surgery will help them feel better. So if you can acknowledge that, you kind of bridge that misunderstanding gap, even if you disagree with the
Right.
details.
I think it's huge. And I say this similar thing to parents. There often is an element of mastery to estrangement. And you have to kind of speak to that. Kind of why are they doing this? It may be purely hurtful to the parent, but for the adult child, to your point, it can be an expression of autonomy, of individuality, of identity. It can feel like it's a way to master parts of themselves that they feel more at odds with, their quirkiness, as you say, or their depression or their anxiety or other things. So speaking to that aspiration, is really, really useful.
Yeah. So I want to share with you a couple of elements of what I call a reset conversation, which it's interesting because your work is so revolved around adults. And I haven't put so much, haven't thought about it so much in terms of age. But in this work, especially with all the neurodivergence and learning disabilities, we tend to see, like, despite a kid being a certain number, let's say they're 20, sometimes they're operating at the level of a 15-year-old.
For sure.
And sometimes these kids are gifted. So like in some domains of life, they are absolutely way ahead of their years. And then other ways, they're very socially immature. So it's very interesting how there's this kind of discrepancy between, like, yes, as you say, technically the ship has sailed. You can't do anything specifically, legally speaking, with a 19-year-old. However, sometimes they're operating at a younger age. But
Right.
in the reset conversation, what I invite parents to do is to first really reflect on the specific dynamics in their family situation. And the more individualized the reset conversation can be, I think the more effective it can be. And so a
Hmm.
reset conversation acknowledges the dynamics that have unfolded between the two parties
Uh-huh.
and tries to kind of like commit to doing things differently moving forward, the parent taking
Right.
responsibility for that. So it might sound
Mhm.
something like, honey, I've been thinking a lot about how things have gone over the last 2 years regarding your gender identity. And I know that I don't always understand where you're coming from. And every time you've talked to me about gender, I've only shared my worries. I've only shared my concerns. And even though I still have those, I understand that from your perspective, that makes it very hard for you to open up to me. And I want to
Mm.
do a much better job listening. So, that is a way of kind of outlining what has happened
Right.
and
Yep.
committing to something different. And it's very similar to a lot of what you say in the amends
Mhm.
letter. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that, or do there just like our two things have kind of emerged with very similar tracks, I
Yeah,
think.
no, I think it's very similar to how I think about these things, to acknowledge the ways that you contribute to the child withdrawing. And, some of the parents I work with actually handle things brilliantly from the outset and they still get estranged. So
Yeah.
even when the parent
Yes.
does, there's no guarantee. But I mean, even if the parent, has objectively, done a good job, they can still say that maybe I didn't do a good job. Or maybe there's other things in our past that led you to feel like you couldn't be open with me or couldn't trust me with this kind of conversation. I do want to do a better job. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think my way that I would handle it's very aligned with yours in that sense.
Joshua and I talked for more than an hour, and I think the real gems in this conversation were the role plays we did. I wanted to give parents really concrete examples of how you could talk to your child if you feel like you're on the verge of estrangement or they're pulling away. So here are the two scenarios we played out. The first one, Jason is a 20-year-old young adult male who's at university. Now, Jason is still in touch with his parents, though he is becoming more distant. He's really struggling with a lot of mental health issues and has become more and more isolated, spending a lot of time in his dorm room, online, and starting to struggle academically for the first time in his life because he's actually really gifted. Every time Jason's parents try to bring up gender or share their concerns about medicalization, Jason gets more distant. He's now making an ultimatum. Either parents have to get on board and accept his medical decisions, or he's going to cut them out of his life. And the second role play we did was about Cassie, who's an 18-year-old female, a senior in high school, and she has some learning difficulties. She's been living a double life where she puts on a masculine persona at school, but at home, mom and dad see glimmers of her authentic self. She's passionate about art, creative, she's into fashion, etc. Her parents have observed that Cassie gets moody and depressed on Sunday nights as the weekend comes to a close. And then when school starts on Monday, she hides herself in baggy clothes and noticeably strains to lower her voice. Gender has become an incredibly heated topic in Cassie's family, and recently, her parents have tried to focus on quality time, improving their relationship, and they even had a reset conversation which significantly eased some of the tensions at home. For the most part, Cassie was receptive, but still acts a bit guarded and suspicious when her parents try to bring up gender. Cassie gets nervous that her parents are trying to prove that she doesn't know who she really is and talk her out of being trans. So those were the two scenarios that Joshua and I did role plays for. And we also talked about parents who are actually estranged, because sometimes sending I love you texts once a week is actually not the right strategy and can end up pushing your adult child away even further. And I know it's counterintuitive. So if you want to watch those role plays and hear us talk about estrangement, please join me in my parent membership group on Subscribestar. I'll be sure to include the link below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.